Alright, today's lesson we're going to explore cameras in Maya, just some basics, how to set up a new camera. We're going to look at cameras with aims, and then we're going to look at some of the settings under Maya software and Arnold rendering settings, and just kind of like, how to do kind of a best practice of where your renders are going to end up on your computer, and one way that you can save out your renders. There's lots of different ways. We're going to look at one way to just kind of a beginner perspective, get you set up and going. So I have a simple scene here. As you can see, I've got a cube, the old classic cube. I brought up my rendering tab, and by bringing up the rendering tab, you'll notice we've looked at lights before in earlier lessons. And right here at the end of the lights, create camera on the grid. Now if I click this button, boom, there is a representation of a camera in my scene. It's sort of this like green outline. You won't see the camera when you render. It's an invisible object, but they want to give you this representation of sort of like an old-fashioned film camera. The other place you can create it is just go to create and down to cameras, and you've got a few more options, and we'll talk about the camera and aim in just a minute. So once I have this camera in my scene, I can move it around. I can, do all sorts of things. I can rotate it. There's lots that you can do with it, right? But I find the easiest way to kind of pose my camera, to actually like see what's going on with the camera, is to look through the camera, right? So to do that in my perspective view, I'm going to change. If I go to panels and I go to perspective, instead of currently I'm on the perspective camera, I'm going to change to the camera one. Now I'm looking through the camera, and what's great about this is I can just use my normal viewport navigation. I can use my combination of option and left click or middle click for panning or rotate around, and as you can see in my other views here, it's moving my camera. If I zoom out, it moves the camera back a little bit to see more of the scene, right? So really easy way to kind of navigate around. At any point, if you want, you can always go back to panels and change back to your perspective view, but your camera stays in that position, right? So very nice. Well, I'm going to go back and change back to camera one again, and you could rename this whatever you want. I could name this camera, camera 58, or just close-up camera, or far-off camera. When I have finished a model that I'm doing, I might have 3, 4 different cameras in the scene, and that's really nice because then I can just switch camera, render out, switch to another camera, render out. So I might have a far-off shot, I might have a close-up, I might have a low angle, so I can have cameras all throughout the whole scene, and then I can just take my turn rendering each one. Now over in the attributes, the camera has a lot of really cool stuff in here. We're just going to go over some of the basics. We're going to talk about, first off, just the basic camera attributes here. So right off the bat, I've got camera, and I'm going to show you what happens when I play with the angle of view. So when you change the angle of view, this combination of focal length and angle of view, if you've ever heard of a telephoto lens or a wide angle lens, so if I have a wide angle of view, I can see really far, or like to the left, to the right, forward. It's kind of like, you go too far and you get almost a perspective like a fisheye view. It kind of warps the perspective a bit. So a wide angle lens is really great if you're inside a space and it's a tight space, or you go inside of an object and you're trying to kind of look out through the cracks, or you're in the corner of a room and you want to see the whole room. You can get a nice wide angle lens. But you can actually see the lens is changing length on my virtual camera there. If I change the angle of view this way, I get a little longer lens and it kind of zooms in on it, right? Well, I can do the same thing. I can have a wide angle telephoto. I can like zoom in on an object. You can see it. Whoa, that lens will get like crazy long, just like a big old zoom lens will, like a nature photographer would have on his big 35mm camera. But I can also have a wide angle of view on a zoom, so it's kind of fun. They work together. They jump around a little bit. So it's not like you can have like super wide and a super zoom. That's not going to work. So there's a ratio between them, but you can try to find a happy medium between them and get like exactly what you're looking for. So wide angle and zoom there, so you don't always have to move the object, the camera, like I'm doing here. I can just change the focal length, but that's also going to change the angle of view. Okay, you can also turn on these cool, I like this display frustum. This gives you the kind of view angle, a visual line of like what your camera is seeing at any given time. So if I change that angle of view to wider, you see how it widens out those lines. I can bring this in. Again, this is just in your preview. You're not going to see this in the render. There's also this display near clip and far clip. We'll talk about that later. That has more to do with when we get into depth of field, which we're not going to cover in this lesson, but in a future, more advanced camera lesson. There are some cool things here under film back. You can literally like try to recreate like a 35 millimeter TV camera or a film camera, or like an old Super 16 millimeter camera, and it'll set the camera up to kind of have that field of view. 16 millimeter theatrical. There's even an IMAX in here. So you can really play around and just decide what kind of camera you like. You're literally recreating a camera from the real world, and you can even create some like impossible cameras in here, which is pretty cool. Lots more to play with in here. Future lesson, we're going to talk about aperture and focal length and how you can get simulated depth of field. But that should get you started with basic cameras. The other thing I like to show, I'm going to delete this camera. If you go up to create and down to cameras, there's also this one called a camera and aim. So if I bring that in, what you get is you get a camera, but you also get an aim object. So if I take my camera, I'm just going to move it back a little bit. And then I click on this aim, you'll see it's a group here. If I unfold it, there's the camera and there's the aim in my outliner, right? So if I take the aim, what's great is if you pair your aim with an object, whatever object you want to sort of be the center of focus in your shot, now as I move my camera around, watch this. It automatically rotates to always be looking at the object, at that aim. I can tilt it up and it's automatically going to rotate. This is really good for doing like flybys, and it just kind of makes it convenient, specifically if you want it to always be kind of focused on one part of your image. When you get into animation later, you can animate the camera, and the aim could be paired with, say, the cube. Wherever the cube moves, the camera will follow it. Or you could have the aim move with the camera and get some really unique dynamic kind of like dolly shot stuff going on. So I really love the aim. I think it's very convenient, and it really helps so you're not always having to like slightly rotate the camera. Again, if I go to my view here and go to perspective and look through the camera, as I move these around, you'll see I can get these really cool kind of like far off little flybys going on, right? I know we're not animating yet, but really convenient way to kind of just be able to manipulate your camera in a different way, maybe when you're not used to. So maybe I can come in here and I can get this guy nice and close and get like a really cool close-up shot of that corner. So cameras, camera aims, very useful. All right, so hand in hand with cameras, we're now going to talk about rendering. Rendering, most of your rendering options are going to be right up here at the top. So this key one right here is the little kind of cut board with a little gear icon, the blue gear icon. When I click on that, in past lessons we've already talked about the difference between the Maya software and the Arnold render. Under Maya software, this is all pretty much the same. The big things you want to watch out for is the first thing under file output. You want to choose a particular file format that works for you. I recommend JPEGs if you're just looking at some quick previews of your renders. If you want something without compression, then maybe you want to do a PSD or you want to do a TIFF. Arnold render doesn't have this many options. There's even GIFs in here if you wanted to do that. I think Arnold only does JPEGs and TIFFs. I don't think they have Photoshop file. Later down the road, we'll be talking about EXF files. Those are more advanced. But for right now, probably going to stick with JPEGs, TIFF files, which are really high quality and lossless, and Photoshop files, which are also high quality and lossless. But for now, I'm going to choose a JPEG. As I scroll down, if you don't know what alpha channels are, you should do a little bit of homework. Alpha channels will allow you to have a transparent background. So JPEGs don't work with alpha channels, but TIFFs do. So this TIFF format, as does Photoshop, and PNGs also do as well, although I don't think Maya exports PNGs natively. So if I want to do this, what would happen is, because I have no background behind here, it would just render out with like a black background. But if I have alpha channel turned on and I export it as a TIFF, when I go to bring that into Photoshop, it'll be transparent, so I can put any background I want behind it. So it gives you a lot of options in post. So I always say, why not? If you have an object and there's no environment, anything behind it, go ahead and export it as a TIFF, leave the alpha channel on, which is already on by default, and you're good to go. Now another important one is renderable camera right here. You can see by default it's on perspective, but if I actually want to render camera 1, I need to choose it. So I need to make sure I choose the right camera view. Now you can see I can also do a top, a side, front view, anything like that as well. But for right now I want to choose the camera 1. And last but not least, we have image size. This is really controls the resolution of the image. So highly recommend at least doing like an HD 1080p. This gives you a resolution of 72, 1920 by 1080 HD. Anything below that, you're getting really low res imagery. But you can go much higher. Like if you want print quality, you could type in 300 on the resolution there, and make these 3000 by 5000. Just know you increase the render quality there, and it's going to take a lot longer to render out, especially if you have a computer that doesn't quite meet the system specs of Maya. So if you have a slower machine, stick with that standard. Just come on down to HD 1080. That's a good one. Easy to preview, easy to share. But if you have a computer that can handle it, bump it up to 150 or bump it up to 300 and try increasing these pixel dimensions, and you'll get a higher res image. All right, last but not least, there is this Maya software tab. You can increase the number of samples, and this will give you a higher quality render. A little bit, sometimes you get noise in the shadow areas, like a little bit of pixelization. This will decrease that. You can also increase your anti-aliasing to a higher quality. That's kind of like how edges are smooth, especially curved edges. So there's some like presets you can do in here: intermediate, preview quality, production quality, contrast sensitive, 3D motion production, all of that. But watch out, again, you increase the number of samples, you increase your render time, you increase the quality of one of these presets or of anti-aliasing, again, you increase render quality. So keep that in mind as you don't go crazy and like dial it up to 10 or something like that. This is going to take 20 on the shading, is going to take a really long time. But maybe I want to bump this up to like medium quality. That's at a 6. High quality, that's 19. So maybe medium quality you want to bump it up to and see what happens on that. Okay, see what kind of quality level you get. Now the only thing that changes here when we move over to Arnold, if I go to the Arnold render, we get our file format, the image format changes. Now you can see we only have JPEG, TIFF, EXR. Actually, PNG is in here. I forgot that Arnold does PNG. That's great. So PNG, there is some loss to that. It's not like a perfectly lossless format, but it does support alpha channels. So if you want to do the alpha channel background and be able to drop in any background you want in Photoshop, then a PNG and a TIFF are going to be your friends. If you don't care about the transparency, then just go with the JPEG, or go with the TIFF. That's a higher quality, either one. For the most part, I'd recommend TIFF. I think it's just going to be the easiest to work with, or PNG over the JPEG. Again, there's the alpha channel. Again, make sure you choose the right camera, so that you choose the camera that you have in your scene. Remember to set your resolution down here, at least HD 1080, but you could always increase your resolution or the pixel dimensions. One thing I like to show is that what you have in your render view isn't always what's going to render out. So make sure every once in a while you look at like your resolution gate. If you turn this little guy on, this little I'm sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. This one here, that gives you one view, and this gives you the other. So this is going to give you really what's that's visible. Anything that's white is cropped out with a 1920 by 1080 view, right? But watch what happens when I change to like 540 and close. Oh, actually, that's pretty close. Let me bring that back up. That didn't change my viewport very much. Let's try 4K square. See how 4K 4096 pixels, that changes the frame, the cropping of what I'm going to do. So make sure that whatever you have zoomed in on, you're actually going to see it all with that 1920 by 1080. And again, that's just by turning on this little button here in your viewport, the gate mask, and that will show you your resolution gate, which is really handy. Last but not least, under Arnold Render, you have a few more things you can play with. You can increase sampling on the camera, on diffusion on your material and shaders, specular quality, transmission if maybe something's transmission has transparency to it, SSS, which is a more advanced kind of material shader quality inside of a Arnold shader, and volume indirect. So way more to go into here, but increase these up, but I really wouldn't go past like 4 or 5 at max, because Arnold's going to really exponentially take a lot longer when you use that Arnold render. Alright, so once you get your render settings where you want, you can go ahead and close this. One of the last things I like to show is just you need to think about where your files are going to be rendered. So I'm just going to show you one quick way to render your stuff, right? So I'm going to go under File. If you get onto Project window, this is a great window to know about in Maya. This kind of controls where all of your files are going, because Maya by default puts things into a location that you might not be aware of. So like on my computer, it puts all of my default stuff into the user folder, then into the name of my user, which is nmd-imfa, then into the documents folder, then into a Maya folder, then into a separate projects folder there. So you kind of have to dig for it on your computer to find it. I like to make it easier, so you can see my images actually has a custom. I put my user, NMD-IMFA, I put it right on the desktop into an untitled folder. And you can change that by clicking on the folder here and just saying, I want to put it on my desktop. And before I came in here, I just went to my desktop and created an untitled folder real quick, right? So now that I have that, you'll see over here, there's my untitled folder. I can choose it and select it. Now, anytime I render, my renders are going to show up in this folder, right? So now that I've done that with that project window, I can come up here and I can go to Open Render View, and I can click this button right here, Render the Current Frame. Oh, I probably should have put a light in there. Hold on. Let me go to Arnold, since I'm using the Arnold render, and put in a sky dome. There we go. And let's do that again. There we go. There's that really boring gray cube. If I go to the untitled folder in temp, there it is. Lovely. 1920 by 1080. If I look there, there's the resolution. It's in a JPEG format. Good to go. A lot of people get lost and do this like save image here, but it doesn't give you, I can go to save image and put it on my desktop and give it a name, test render. But then you have to choose the file format here, and things get a little wonky sometimes, and save it. There it is. Still had the same resolution, which is cool, 1920 by 1080. So there's multiple ways to save out of Maya. I'm just showing you two. I tend to, like I said, just know they're always going to go to this untitled folder, and then I can have multiple renders that all show up there ready to go, right? Keep in mind, if you then save another render to this folder, you might, if you have multiple cameras, you might want to save out versions with different names so that each one kind of gets its own name as we go. Because if I change this now and come back up here and render again, and I go back to my folder, it just overrode that and just rendered it out again on top of it. So it kind of like deleted the old one and put the new one in, right? So if I have multiple cameras to switch by, I would maybe then save as and say camera 1 and save that to my desktop. Continue. And now when I go to render, it should save it with a different name. Let's see if it did it. Yep. Now camera 1, right? Now I can close that and render view, and then maybe I go and I switch to perspective view and go to my render settings on this one and change from camera 1 back to perspective, and I save this as camera 2. So you have multiple files. Put that on my desktop as well, continue, and then I open that up and render that guy out. And now if I go back to that untitled folder, there's the camera 2 image. So it's going to take the name based on the file name as whatever you've saved it as. So unless you want that overwritten, just make sure you save out multiple versions of the same file at the end and then activate the camera in each of those, and then you can just go through them and render them out. Otherwise, like I said, you can always do this file save image as well in the render view, so that's another way to render them out. Okay, that was a very quick and just kind of easy intro to cameras and rendering in both the software at Arnold Renders and Maya. Future lessons will look at depth of field and some of the more advanced camera settings, and we'll be definitely looking at more render settings, particularly in the Arnold render in the future. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.